Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to the second to last class. Keep in mind we don't have a class next week because of the Easter break, but then there is a subsequent class after that on April 12th. But I don't know if we'll come back for the on-site portion of that, since the thought of returning to campus after the break is somewhat daunting, so I'll decide about that. But we do have one more class after this, and of course the final test on Monday, April 17th, open between 7 and just before midnight on that day. Talk about that next time. Similar format to the first two tests. So the material that we're getting through today, well, this is towards the end of the 20th century and leading into the 21st century. Just to pick up where we left off last time, speaking about America's victory in the Cold War. Now, as I mentioned last time, maybe it wasn't so much America's victory as just the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I mean, that's essentially what it was. But the dissolution of the Soviet Union was, in many respects, a kind of a gift to America, and in particular, a gift to Ronald Reagan's presidency, because it kind of validated his position and his approach, although the disintegration of the Soviet Union could have happened during a different administration. So that was perhaps a little bit of a red herring, except for one detail, which I'll get into. I was mentioning this last time, the reasons behind the breakup of the Soviet Union, the thought that this was some kind of inevitable process, which was basically the way it was framed by Western commentators after the fact, the inevitable triumph of democracy and capitalism, if not the United States. But I think the subtext of that was the drive towards freedom, the idea that freedom and the desire for liberty among the people is this kind of animating principle, and this is moving forward with a kind of inexorable energy. And thus, with the Soviet Union, there was a steadily growing grassroots quest for freedom, individual liberation. It was always there, boiling beneath the surface. And then Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the USSR, introduces a bunch of reforms, and basically what the reforms do is allow this desire for freedom to kind of swell to the surface and overflow, thus toppling the Soviet regime. Well, I think it would be good if we could see the ideal of freedom as a principle that always increases in human history, although history rarely follows that kind of linear pathway anyway. It's circuitous and involves all sorts of deviations, and we can see that in the case of the former Soviet Union. It doesn't appear as though the drive towards democracy and individual freedom has taken some kind of inevitable course. You only have to look at some of the former republics of the Soviet Union to understand this. Belarus, for instance, is well known for its draconian, authoritarian, and totalitarian regime. Right now, with its rigged elections, clearly rigged elections supported by Russia, is obviously not running a democracy at all right now, but that is a former Soviet regime. The logic of this idea of the drive towards history should have been that Belarus would move towards more democracy, and so too with Turkmenistan, which was also part of the Soviet Union, which is obviously an authoritarian regime to this day. So that hasn't really played out. In fact, how about Russia itself? I mean, is Russia really running a democracy right now, a full-fledged democracy, with Vladimir Putin remaining in power for this extended period of time, and its surveillance of its citizens and this kind of police state mentality, which has actually increased since the 1990s. So that isn't really the kind of ironclad explanation for what happened here. We should tackle the question of what actually did happen. Well, I mean, myriad factors, all sorts of different things we could get into. I don't think there's really one answer, but I would say if there was a kind of overarching explanation for the destruction of the USSR at the particular time when it happened, late 80s, early 90s, well, here is one explanation that has been offered, and this is something I mentioned previously, that the Soviet Union was always an artificial construct. It was never a single nation nation state, but rather a conglomerate of different republics. I think 15 republics in total. So not just Russia, but Russia as the main state, and then a bunch of smaller states kind of attached to it. And when we look at the map today, what strikes us, I think, now in the 2020s is the thought that it's actually strange that this was ever a single country, because look at the countries that were included in it: Estonia, Latvia, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, yes, also Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan. I mean, they're such different countries. I mean, that's the thought that comes to mind today, with different cultures, different traditions, different ethnicities. So it was never really this fully integrated system, but rather a kind of aggregate of different republics. People speak about increasing nationalism within these republics, especially the desire to get away from what was basically an imperialist relationship. But what is kind of interesting as well is that Russian nationalism also played a role in the breakup of the USSR. In fact, Boris Yeltsin was the first president of the Russian Republic, kind of campaigned on an idea of Russian nationalism, which worked in opposition to the USSR. I say there, the 15 republics were built around a classic center-periphery relationship. This kind of gets into the kind of inner workings of the system here. You have all of these different peripheral republics. Even Russia was kind of peripheral. Peripheral to what? Well, to the Soviet Union itself, to the kind of centralized party system, the bureaucracy of the party apparatus. That plays the role of the center, and the center basically saps up the resources from all across the country and thus redistributes them as it sees fit. So all of these places supply something to the center, whether you're talking about petroleum, foodstuffs like grain or machinery or labor or whatever it might be. They all supply something, but it all inevitably flows towards the center because that is the coercive dominant power. So what happens when you introduce policies like perestroika and glasnost, restructuring and openness? The tendency is for all of these republics, including, ironically, Russia itself, to kind of bunker down and take care of their own interests, because suddenly they're not being coerced and forced into feeding the Soviet system anymore. If you take away the coercive power, they all start acting as though they're independent nations. No, it's just our petroleum. We're not going to use it to just feed this kind of distant party apparatus. We're just going to use it for our own people. No, it's our grain. It's our food. We're just going to use it for our own people. And so the supply line into the center dries up, and thus the center starts to starve because it's no longer just sapping up all the resources from elsewhere. I think that basically explains the kind of Soviet economic crisis that started to happen in the late 80s and early 90s. It was a product of this kind of increasing liberalization and self-determination, which manifested itself not strictly as the people's drive towards freedom, although that was certainly part of it, but as a kind of national self-interest that developed, and it kind of split the country apart, the artificial construct, into its 15 different republics. What was the center doing? Why was the Soviet a central regime sapping up all of these resources? What was it doing with them? Well, precisely constructing this superpower state. I mean, that's essentially what they were doing all along. You had, of course, a lot of corruption within the USSR. You had various party bureaucrats who would hoard consumer goods. But there was also a very active black market in the USSR as well. But in terms of making use of the mana, the resources, well, it went into these big mega projects. The Mir space station, for instance, which construction on that began in the 1980s. The Russian version of the Concorde, one of those kind of forgotten side notes of history. Yes, the USSR developed a supersonic jet of its own, which flew in a very limited vein. And all the other things, the military, for instance, I mean, think of all the kind of resources of money you need to feed a giant national military, giant factories and big dams, railroad networks, all of those different things. Now, people could say, well, wasn't it the case that the Soviet government basically robbed from its own people just for the purposes of competing with America with the space race, competing with America on the level of the military and nuclear arms. And yes, that seems to have been what happened. But kind of the opposite is also true. It was thanks to this massively coordinated top-down system that the Soviet Union was able to compete with America in the first place, because otherwise they never would have been able to. So it kind of goes the other way around. Remember what I said previously. The Soviet standard of living was never close to being equal to America's standard of living. The Soviet Union, by and large, was a poor country in comparison to America. Nonetheless, they have a world-class space program and a giant military with all of these nuclear weapons due to this kind of centralized government system, which keeps the people poor, but nonetheless feeds all these giant infrastructural projects that they're invested in. You see a similar kind of dynamic developing in China today. Again, China, comparatively speaking, if you compare it to the United States, is a poor country, but nonetheless comes close to competing with America on a larger scale due to this kind of collectivization and coordination through the party apparatus. The 1990s, so the Cold War basically ends in the late 80s with the fall of the Berlin Wall. That was when the Eastern Bloc states basically declared independence. It's only in 1991, following a failed coup attempt, that the Soviet Union itself breaks up. This takes us into the 90s in American history. There was an event that kind of kicked off the 90s. That was Saddam Hussein, leader of Iraq from 79 to 2003. His invasion of Kuwait in 1990. So Saddam Hussein invades basically a neighboring country for a variety of reasons, but partly due to the petroleum resources in Kuwait. And this provoked the Gulf War, which was a U.S.-led coalition which expelled the Iraqi forces without toppling his regime. That was a kind of sort of unfinished business, at least from the standpoint of the hawkish American foreign policy. And this seemed to be one of those events which kicked off the 1990s on a decidedly triumphant note. The story probably would have been different if the American coalition actually had tried to take down Hussein's regime, but instead this was a kind of containment policy. And there was this idea that this was some kind of retribution for America after the catastrophes of the Vietnam War, which were not that distant in the year 1990. Keep in mind, withdrawal of the American forces only in the early 70s, so this was a kind of retribution for that. This leads into the 90s. This marked the true beginning of the digital revolution, topic I talked about in the British and European cultural history class, which I can talk about a bit further next time. The advent of the personal computer. Personal computers were a thing in the 80s, but not really widespread. They really became more ubiquitous during the 90s. This was also the period for the internet as well. Internet was not a thing prior to the 90s, and when it first developed, emerged, there wasn't a lot on the internet. It took a lot of time for it to develop into the kind of monster, the beast that it is today. This was also the era of the end of history. Here's another idea I brought up previously, which promoted the triumphalist idea that democracy is the only viable political system and capitalism the only viable economic system. This was actually the mentality, a very 1990s ideological stance. The notion that we have, or the world as a whole, has tried out a variety of different approaches. Communism obviously was the main one, a kind of communist experiment that was attempted in the Soviet Union that lasted throughout the course or most of the 20th century. Yes, we gave that a shot, and it was a dismal failure, and thus the collapse of the communist regime. And now we've entered a new era where we have basically affirmed that there is only one way for the rest of the world to go. We have basically acknowledged that democracy is the only legitimate political system that works. That's not to say that it is completely widespread at the time, but just that there are a bunch of holdouts. a bunch of regimes that are clinging to outmoded systems of authority and power, and they too will disintegrate over time. I mean, this is actually what they thought. And also capitalism as an economic system. Communism had never really been communism as Karl Marx imagined it. It was always a kind of bastardized version of capitalism. But again, the basic idea of we've tried a different approach. There was an attempt to take us out of the current material paradigm, but it seems as though neoliberalism, capitalism, private markets, private enterprises and businesses, private ownership of property, those are the only really efficient systems. I say there, the idea promised the end of ideology, and yet what is more ideological than naturalizing political and economic systems? That's the kind of the irony of the 90s, because that's the most ideological thing you can possibly do. When you take a political system and you act as though it's only natural that the world is like this, because it presents capitalism as this kind of all-encompassing totality, something that exists on an almost cosmic level, and we just all work against the backdrop of it. And so, yes, we can have individual moments of resistance and rebellion and little pockets of dissent, workers' strikes and rebellions, but we can't change the overall picture. That is just fixed in place. And so too with the democratic system. Now, keep in mind, democracy takes a whole lot of different forms, but that's the mentality at the time in the 90s. You can question a lot of things that happen within politics in America, but you can't question the democratic system itself, because we've already proven that it is the only legitimate system we can possibly have. So this is a kind of interestingly, very fundamentally ideological stance, which kind of masquerades as being the end of ideology. The other thing that's intriguing about this is that when you stop and think about it, you think about history, there is one thing that holds true today, held true in the past, and I'm sure it will hold true in the future. And here's another irony of something holding true in the future, is that we cannot see what's going to happen in the future. It is completely pointless, meaningless for us to map out exactly what is going to happen 20 years from now, 40 years from now, 50 years from now, and say, well, this is all just part of this inexorable tidal movement to a particular vision of the world, because we have no idea what's going to happen in the future. Nonetheless, these ideas held very strong sway during the 1990s. That's not to say that everyone living in America was happy during the 90s. In fact, the era actually became known as a period of a certain level of disillusionment and disaffection. I would say, especially among young people, a counterpoint in a way to the counterculture movement that had prevailed during the 1960s. And I think that part of this was indeed due to this end of history ideology, which presented this kind of inevitable social system that you just have to accept. And it did seem to foster a lot of kind of dead ends or a feeling of general conformism. And the trend among many people was a feeling of alienation, of being kind of divorced from this overarching narrative that keeps telling you you're living in the best possible society, keeps telling you that there is no reason to try and change the system, keeps telling you indeed that you should be happy, because that perhaps was not people's experiences in many cases, and there's a kind of search for a different kind of narrative, a sort of anti-conformist narrative, which would be more in line with the way people are actually feeling and actually experiencing things. You see Kurt Cobain, lead singer of Nirvana. I think Nirvana's music kind of summarized that era. If you listen to the music now, you can get that sense of disaffection and disillusionment with the overarching culture that exists at the time, which was fairly prevalent during the 90s. 90s were also the Clinton years as well. And talk about someone who kind of personified, embodied an entire era, the sort of acceptance of a general overarching system, and also this kind of idea of the American Democrat Party establishment, which I would say subsequent Democrat Party establishment regimes have been eager to recapture. I mean, that was kind of Barack Obama, now Joe Biden. They're living in the 90s in terms of their mentality of what what American government and what American culture is supposed to be. But this was also the era not just for good governance, but also for scandal mongering and muckraking reaching a heightened level. We'd already seen this developing in American politics with Richard Nixon, for instance. And then also remember Ronald Reagan, the former actor turned politician, that blurring of boundaries between politics and reality TV. Well, here you saw another dimension of it because Bill Clinton's legacy is so caught up with this affair that he had with a White House intern, Monica Lewinsky, which spanned actually part of his re-election campaign. Now, there's almost a sense that everyone was just waiting for this kind of story because Clinton's reputation was already well known even before he was elected, to the point that he and his wife, Hillary, went on 60 Minutes, that famously serious television program, to address these allegations and to speak about, quote, marital difficulties that they had had in the past. And I think most people knew what that meant. But then, of course, there were rumors about Paula Jones, and then the story about Monica Lewinsky breaks to the point that Clinton is compelled to go on national TV and offer his famous denial. You know, I did not have sexual relations with that woman. Yeah, that's so believable, right? And the story continues after that. But what's really kind of bizarre about the whole thing is the impeachment process that follows after that, as though we really needed to impeach the president for perjury and have this kind of endless pawing over of the sordid details of this affair, as though this needed to be blown up for the American national imagination, as though this is what American politics had become. Essentially, this kind of shit show of just going through someone's personal life in intricate detail. And that was really what the impeachment seemed to amount to. It was sufficiently unpopular with the American public that the impeachment basically collapsed with nothing happening. But you could say the damage was done. Clinton's legacy is now inextricably linked to Monica Lewinsky forevermore. And think about this, too, as sort of a counterpoint to Richard Nixon. Remember the Nixon tapes, this idea of shining a light on the Oval Office, turning the Oval Office inside out to see what's really going on behind those walls. In Nixon's case, it was the revelation of this personality, paranoid, bigoted, with just his small circle of people who he trusted. Well, with Clinton, it was a kind of different story. Again, turning the Oval Office inside out to see the sexual scandal that's going on inside there, a kind of different dynamic. So today's and perhaps part of next week's as well, class on 9/11 and the increasing divisions. You could say the 90s, in retrospect, were not the end of history, but rather just something that set up subsequent events, which we're going to take a look at now. There's the itinerary, a couple of things to talk about. The Enron scandal, 9/11, which basically ended the triumphalism of the 90s, the two wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, and Obama. So the Enron scandal, here is another very fascinating story. It's a little bit not forgotten to history, but it's buried somewhat under 9/11 because it overlapped directly with 9/11. But this is something that's worth, I think, pausing over because it speaks a little bit to the economic situation in America, especially relentless privatization and deregulation, and also how the story broke, which I'll mention as well. Enron was an energy giant based in Houston that was named America's most innovative company by Fortune several years running. I think it was 6 years in a row. And this was, as I say, just a mega company doing billions of dollars in revenue. They were involved in energy production, such as things like gas and electricity, but they had aspirations of branching out into other fields. And the company went bust over a shockingly short period of time in 2001, bringing to light a massive accounting fraud, basically a company that had concealed the enormous debts that it had racked up in all sorts of creative ways, and also had defrauded investors, and also had basically rendered their employees' pension funds worthless. And this all came to light over a period of several months. something telling. The CEO of Enron was Kenneth Lay, who was a close friend of President George W. Bush. Enron was one of those kinds of arch privatizing, deregulating companies. Now, that's probably true of most corporations. They aspire to that model. George W. Bush himself was someone who basically inherited that model. The notion of capitalism itself being intrinsically good, but also just privatization being good. That inefficient or ineffective systems are generally publicly owned or state-owned systems. That if you privatize everything, if you just have private companies and corporations competing with one another, you can have a much more efficient way of delivering resources to people. And this was what Enron was involved in. One of its major losing investments was the Dabhol power station in India, aimed at privatizing energy and circumventing an inefficient public utility system in India. So that's just basically the idea of the corporation getting involved in delivering electricity to people in India. So they invest millions of dollars in building this power plant, except that when they get the plant built, they end up charging people too much for the energy. So the point that local people can't actually afford their prices. So this created a big issue, and this was a major losing venture for Enron. That didn't just exist in India, it also existed back home. Enron's practices of market manipulation contributed directly to a sustained energy crisis in California in 2000 and 2001, with many people experiencing rolling blackouts. This was a big issue that actually led to the recall of California's, I believe, governor at the time due to skyrocketing energy prices that occurred. And you can see the difference in how much energy prices actually went up. Was revealed after the fact that this was due in large part to market manipulation on the part of companies like Enron, basically orchestrating energy supply according to factors like supply and demand. Consider that Enron had also been interested in privatizing water supply as well. So stop and think about that for a moment. Electricity, water, those things that are commonly associated with public utilities. And there's different reasons for that, partly because those things require a whole ton of infrastructure, which is usually managed by the state, and also because they don't really operate according to supply and demand, because we always need electricity, we always need water. It's just a kind of regular thing that we always need, but also because they're regarded as being public goods. You know, this idea that, well, the people should have access to water. So what happens when you introduce this kind of relentless privatization and deregulation? Well, you have fluctuations like this developing. Consider the risk if they get into things like water supply, where suddenly water is this private commodity that people have to pay for, that is being orchestrated on this supply and demand basis. It already does operate like that to an extent. There are discrepancies in terms of access to clean drinking water, sewage control, all sorts of things based on economic position. Take it to the level where whether you have this sustainable resource, something you need in order to survive, well, it's being regulated according to prices and markets. So you see the kind of other side of this idea of privatization, capitalization, all market competition among different companies, the risks involved. Risks at Enron, the company, as I said, disintegrated over a very short period of time. I also want to mention briefly how the story originally broke. Well, there was an article, actually, an article published in 2001 that was by the same magazine, Fortune, that labeled Enron America's most innovative company several years in a row. Well, it's incredible the way these things can start, because here you have a high-profile magazine. It runs a feature story which just asks a couple of fundamental questions. You see at the top, in Hollywood parlance, the it girl is someone who commands the spotlight at any given moment, mentions a bunch of people, says, well, Wall Street isn't quite like that, but there is such a thing as an it stock. Enron is really hot right now. It's this kind of glitzy, glamorous thing, this stock that everyone wants. But there you see bolded down there, a very basic question. But for all the attention that's lavished on Enron, the company remains largely impenetrable to outsiders, as even some of its admirers are quick to admit. Start with a pretty straightforward question. How exactly does Enron make its money? Because they had this kind of black box economics, which was difficult to decipher. Underlying answers. They're not making money. They're losing money. They're trying to conceal that fact. Something as simple as a story gets the ball rolling, and there's much more attention shone on Enron's business practices, its accounting frauds, its attempts to conceal debt. The author of the story is this person, Bethany McLean. She's the one who wrote this story, and also would later write a book about the downfall of the company, The Smartest Guys in the Room. And I put this up here. It's almost like a plug in a way to talk about a specific discipline. Because when I first read that story, as I was going through it, I thought, oh, that's interesting. I bet she studied English, because I could tell from the way that she was writing the story, through the use of metaphors, through the use of language, and the general approach, the idea of trying to analyze a text, trying to look beneath the surface of what it's telling you and trying to decipher beneath it. And there you can see her educational background. Williams College studied, yes, English and math, which is an interesting kind of choice of two different disciplines. So if you're wondering about what you should focus on for your studies, or you're wondering about a career, well, I would add a plug for English right here, because it does give you, right, certain skills. Here you have an author who wrote this story, and this is a company that was not just, a multi-billion-dollar company, but backed, supported by people like George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, who are invested in this company doing well. Well, sometimes you just need someone to kind of ask some questions and try to decipher a little bit what the underlying story is, what the underlying narrative is. As I say, Enron was a massive story at the time and has become well known for this idea of corporate fraud and a kind of poster child for this kind of activity, but lost a little bit at the time that it happened because, as I say, it overlapped with the event that captured the American national imagination, which was 9/11. Two topics to consider there: facing evil and conspiracy theories, and the reality of violence in America. On September 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda launched a coordinated attack against the United States using 4 hijacked commercial airliners. The attack destroyed the World Trade Center in New York, the Twin Towers, and damaged the Pentagon. 4th airliner never reached its target, but was taken back over by the passengers, the hostages, and crashed. Almost 3,000 people died. As has been well documented, part of what stands out about these attacks is not just the horror and the devastation that they cause, not just the idea of a direct attack on American soil, but the fact that they were captured live on television as they were occurring, which really speaks to this idea of being in the modern age, the televisual age. One of the Twin Towers had already been hit, so there were live news broadcasts of the tower, and thus the airplane flying into the other tower was captured on live television. Images seen from multiple angles, caught on video recorder, caught in photographs, and splashed not just across America, but also across the world. In his address to the nation on 9/11, George W. Bush immediately framed the attacks as acts of evil, a strategy that would recur over the coming years, because how else would he frame them? The basic dichotomous relationship established immediately, the idea that America represents the land of the good and beneficence and democracy, and thus is subject to an evil attack. And that kind of rhetoric would recur in the 2 wars that followed. This might have been the first acknowledgement that the triumphalist end of history narrative was dead, even as such concessions avoided addressing the full implications of the new reality. I mean, I say the end of history narrative was dead because this idea of a new enemy emerging, or a new kind of figure on the horizon who we must confront. The end of history doesn't really allow a lot of space for this kind of good versus evil dichotomy, because according to this end of history narrative, everything is just chugging along inevitably towards the triumph of American-style democracy and capitalism. So the end of history doesn't really lend itself well to kind of battling against a specific enemy. So this seemed to be the basic end of that narrative. But as I say, I'm not really addressing the full implications of the new reality, because when you stop and think about it, if you work within the general rubric of the end of history, Al-Qaeda is not really a serious threat to that narrative. I mean, there was nobody, other than Al-Qaeda operatives, claiming that their ideology is really a valid alternative to democracy and capitalism. I mean, hell, go around the world and all nation states, or just the vast majority of nation states, are opposed to terrorist cells for their own reasons, if only to maintain the stability of their own governments. I mean, they don't want to be attacked by insurgents or terrorists in any form whatsoever. So even if there are just other ideas and other ideologies out there, it wasn't as though Al-Qaeda really represented the kind of wave of the future. No, there was something else going on. It was just the basic falsity of the narrative that was exposed. Not false because Al-Qaeda would attack America, but false because America could never retain this global superpower position indefinitely. I mean, no way. That does not happen in history, where one country just stays at the vanguard for all time's sake. The pendulum of history swings. There are new threats to deal with. And in the case of America, it hasn't necessarily specifically been a battle against Al-Qaeda that has exposed the underlying weakness of that idea. It's been the decay of American democracy itself, which, when we look back on it in retrospect, might have been occurring much earlier. But 9/11 seemed to be that kind of a stepping over the threshold into a new era where American democracy would start to show more and more signs of dry rot, the kind of idea of a system that does not deliver the principles and ideas that it promises. Conspiracy theories and representations of violence in America. Well, there have been all sorts of conspiracy theories about 9/11 being a kind of inside job, or it was propagated by the government for the purposes of allowing it to go to war against Afghanistan or Iraq. I don't think most people take those theories seriously, but you can kind of understand the symbolic logic of them, if nothing else, because if you look at the United States during the 90s, it's not as though the country had been immune to violence. I mean, in a weird way, 9/11 was almost like the culmination of a steady escalation of representations and depictions of violence, which have been festering in the culture for a long time. And yes, indeed, internal violence, violence that just exists within America, as opposed to the country being at war around the world. There you see a couple of representative images. The Oklahoma City bombing, which you could call an inside job, by a member of a militia, Timothy McVeigh, detonating a bomb which killed numerous people in a government building in Oklahoma City. Towards the end of the decade, the spate of rampage school shootings, which obviously still happen in America today. The Columbine shooting in Colorado, where a pair of high school kids shot a bunch of their classmates in the school, but also just the kind of televisual representation of violence, because this is really the era where you start to see more kind of intricate, detailed, and realistic depictions of violence, not just in films and television shows, although of course those industries are always advancing, but what about video games as well, computer games? I mean, here's something that was talked about a lot at the time. There you see the first-person shooter game Doom, released in 1993. Well, this is not what computer games looked like in the 1980s, right? They were very minimalist and stark because they didn't have the technology. But suddenly you can have on the screen quite realistic depictions of violence and gore and blood, and a character blasting his way through all these different aliens and demons. So it wasn't as though America was this kind of very sanitized place in the 90s. No, the issue of violence seemed pervasive within the country and kind of meshed in a way with what happened on 9/11. It was almost as though an image from a disaster film, a Hollywood film, had been blown up to real life on that day. So the two wars, immediately after 9/11, the American government began preparing for two wars. One, which will be fought in Afghanistan, and the second one in Iraq. I say there, notice that the war in Iraq did not start until 2003, but the U.S. government nonetheless was preparing the war basically right after 9/11 happened. We're going to talk about those. The thing that links them, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, is you'd have to say they were both unmitigated disasters when you look back on them in retrospect. And also the architect of 9/11, Osama bin Laden, notice lives until 2011, so lived a solid 10 years after the attacks. Talk about that as well. Come back after the break.